now give the floor to Ms. Barryl Biekman of the Tiye International as the representative of civil society.
Mr. President, Excellencies, honored guests, representatives of the African families and civil society. I bring you greetings from the members of Tiye International, the African-European Women's Movement Sofidela, the platform of the Dutch Slavery Past, the Global Coalition for the International Decade for People of African Descent, and the worldwide civil society grassroots African families on this historical moment of the launching of the International Decade for People of African Descent. Mr. President, we support the International Decade for People of African Descent and its mandate to follow the recommendations pertaining to the DDPA from the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, as well as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Mr. President, it must be reminded here that the decision to have the International Decade did not come from a gift, not come as a gift from heaven. It came only because of a long struggle by Pan-Africanists, supported by those civil society organizations who were committed to the implementation of the DDPA, and finally because of the hard-working involvement of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Special thanks to Dr. Maria Fanon and Professor Dr. Ferin Shepherd. Not to forget the support of the African Group and the great majority of member states of the United Nations. A special thanks, therefore, goes to the African countries for their role in defending the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and to the African Union to declare African diaspora worldwide families as their sixth region. Mr. President, the launching of the decade today is a great victory for the cause of justice, with the strong reaffirmation of and call for the full and effective implementation of the DDPA. We hope that the implementation of the decade should put a final end to the opposition against undermining of and false promotion regarding the Durban follow-up process, which we have regularly witnessed since the successful World Conference Against Racism in 2001. At the center of the demands during the World Conference Against Racism by African people and in diaspora, under the leadership of the 12 December Reparation Movement and many other Pan-African Reparation Coalition, was the declaration of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid as crimes against humanity. In fact, it was the longest and most depraved crime against humanity ever, which lasted for more than 3 centuries as had been declared by the United Nations, including the Republiek Suriname by its permanent delegation Ambassador Oudenhout in 2001. The transatlantic slave trade, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid destroyed the development of Africa and enriched Europe and the European colonists in the Americas. It established the system of racism and racial discrimination, to be specific, Afrophobia, that affects and has its impact what the African people and in diaspora experience until today. Mr. President, really, sure, you can be sure, we have all reasons to be glad with the establishment of the decade, but we have also reasons to be disappointed, because despite of the adoption of the program of activities by the General Assembly last month, powerful state actors, including those who boycotted the 2009 Durban Review Conference and the 2011 commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the DDPA, continue their efforts to render the DDPA impotent. We deplore the 9 votes cast against and 42 abstentions cast, but salute the 121 votes in favor of the resolution on, against racism and comprehensive implementation of the DDPA, which the 3rd Committee of the General Assembly approved on November 26. At the same time, we are bewildered that abstaining countries succeeded to delete a paragraph from the G77 draft resolution, which had the support of the majority of the countries and which stated, commends the constructive role played by the non-governmental organization in participating in the Durban follow-up mechanism and the Human Rights Council, which has greatly contributed to the development of the program of activities and the preparation for the international decade. Mr. President, truth has the inherent power to produce the promised effects. The full and irrevocable recognition by all countries that the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid was a crimes against humanity is necessary for the credibility of the decade. Without that, we have reason to doubt the sincerity of states to restore the rights of people of African descent during the decade. It is why I, on behalf of the African descent worldwide families, challenge all the national states, parliaments, and governments to officially recognize and declare the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a crimes against humanity, as some countries have already done. We call on all the countries who organized, participated in, and profited from the transatlantic slave trade and the hard slave labor by the kidnapped African ancestors to present their sincere apologies as the first step. And I challenge all governments and parliaments concerned to act on this urgent matter. We strongly welcome the efforts by Caribbean governments and states to place the issue of reparations on the international agenda. For the African descendants family, the adopted theme of the decade, recognition, justice, development, is for us synonymous with the repairing of the damage, which must become the overall concept of the decade. Reparations is not limited to material repair, but something more, Mr. President, fundamental, relating to restoring every aspect of the rights of people of African descent. Mr. President, we therefore invite all member states, as proposed by the Global Coalition for the International Decade for People of African Descent, to recognize and honor the decade as the Reparation Decade. We believe that the right of people of African descent to learn about their rights as enshrined in the DDPA and other human rights instruments must be assured during the decade. The decade must become a framework to address the concentration of misery and disadvantages which people of African descent face everywhere they live. Poverty, racial discrimination, and lack of access to human rights and their institutions, high rates of unemployment and imprisonment, vulnerability to violence, and lack of access to justice, lack of access to good education, healthcare, housing, multiple forms of discrimination, and political and economic marginalization and stigmatization. As educators and scholars across the racial divide agree that A, the primary purpose of education is to uplift and enhance the lives of all individuals. B, it must be the right type of education that engenders positive identity, self-esteem, self-confidence, including love, respect and appreciation for one's history and culture. We therefore call for adapting both formal and informal education for students of African descent and others, so that it is no longer marginalized and relegates Africa and Africans to periphery of anything important, but foremost that our next African generations can say, I'm not afraid because of the color of my skin to be an African. I'm proud to be an African. Mr. President, we have seen the situation faced by people of African descent around the world grow more and more precarious, and we seek urgent and concrete results from the international decade. African diaspora civil society grassroots organizations cannot afford to leave any member of the African diaspora and African society around the world behind. Every forum, every workshop, every review and assessment, every planning session, and every on-the-ground implementation projects must closely involve representatives from civil society and the grassroots communities. And we cannot stress enough the importance of always including women, girls, and young male adults, the future generation, on an equal basis. To leave them behind would be as to leave our hearts and souls, our fellow selves behind as well. I'm coming to the conclusion. When an African American, Mr. President, is strangled to death by police on the streets of New York, we, the people of African descent, feel the same. Everywhere we are, feel the same, that we cannot breathe. We add our voices in solidarity with all those demonstrating to demand justice for the victims of racially based police brutality. This situation makes it clear that institutionalized racism is still alive and that the campaigns against all forms of multiple racism and racial profiling, as well as symbolic and psychological violent situation in different countries, must be intensified. Whether the Black Pete figure in the yearly Dutch Santa Claus cultural historical tradition is just a problem in the Netherlands because of the revival of stereotype of African black people, or interlinked to similar historical cultural tradition, still stereotypical language like some people continue to call us nigger, and racist situation in other parts of Europe and the rest of the world. Mr. President, on behalf of the worldwide African diaspora families, I invite all of you to join hands with us for the implementation of the program of activities in the spirit of recognition, justice, and development, because this decade requires the committed support and involvement of all international, regional, national sectors of society, stakeholders, and people of goodwill in the world. I invite you all to make this reparation decade a great success.